Not that there hasn't been enough self-confession going on, but I have some confession to make. I have a confession to make. Preachers are liars. There, I said it. But I've got to be careful about how I say it, considering the number of clergy who have recently either been accused or have been caught or have admitted using their power and influence to harass or assault other church members and things like that. That's a whole different category. That involves abuse of power and serious violations of clergy ethics and professional boundaries and things like that. I spent all day in Lafayette yesterday teaching about that to some clergy. See, that's a topic and a sermon for another time and another place. What I'm talking about this morning isn't as insidious. It's different. It's more general. But to be clear, let me say it again. Preachers are liars. Okay, well, so how is this, you might ask? Well, where do I begin? Well, the best place to begin is in the beginning. So, I came to faith later on in life than some people who have grown up in the church. I came to faith at church camp in July of 1983, and then I was baptized into the Veneta Alliance Church on November 18th, 1984. I didn't grow up in the church, but my family always gave me the freedom to explore matters of faith and religion. So that's how I came to faith. And so my youth pastor, Greg Johnson, he said to me, Jesse, you have got some gifts for ministry. I think someday you would make a good minister. And I says, Greg, you don't understand. I have some problems with the church. And he said, that's exactly why you'll be a good minister. So thus began my journey as a liar. Even before I was ordained, heck, even before I graduated from high school, I discovered that you had to be very careful about how, where, and to whom you say, I have some problems with the church. And so, I kept quiet. I went to college to begin my training. I started teaching Sunday school classes. I started leading youth groups. And I learned that you had to be extra cautious about asking questions, expressing doubts, and offering opinions about how the church's values don't often line up with Jesus' values. Granted, I was at a disadvantage because I didn't understand church culture. I wasn't familiar with all the traditions and unspoken rules that someone who started out in the cradle learned over the years. But I found out that there were all sorts of people, a multitude of people who were quick to school me in those traditions, none of which seemed to have anything to do with what I was learning in my study of the Bible. And at some level, I completely understood why some of these unspoken rules and taboos were important to church folks, even though those rules were probably more related to personal preferences and culture rather than core value biblical principles. So things like placement of the communion table, where should it go? Translations of the Bible, should we have a flag in the church? Practicing tired old traditions just because it's tradition. Hymns with horrific theology. Those type of things. In the long run, I had to ask myself, is it really worth making a fuss over? Well, it all depends on who you talk to. So I learned to keep my mouth shut. Later on in my journey of ministry, Dick Ham, who used to be the general minister and president of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, he told me this. He framed it this way. He says, don't get into the habit of being crucified on 6-inch crosses. People will stop listening to you. And so I thought, okay, my failure to speak up about things that may very well warrant a legitimate biblical challenge isn't so much a blatant lie as it is an omission. Okay? An omission. I can live with that. Shoot, it's almost like ministry survival. If you get on a soapbox about every little thing that bothers you, people just tune you out and you accomplish nothing. But still, preachers are liars. So here's some examples of more blatant lies, lies that aren't just lies by omission. Like when we struggle with the tension of holding faith and doubt in balance. What? What do you mean? Preachers don't doubt. Preachers aren't supposed to doubt, right? Or when the tension between certainty and disbelief comes into play. Disbelief, that's even worse than doubt. What in the world is wrong with you, preacher? I want to make this clear. We don't intend to lie, but when we realize that when our very livelihood and vocational security sometimes depend on being less than authentic, we do. And so we gradually start crafting this and a renovated, sanitized version of ourselves that's more suitable for public consumption. One that reflects more of what we think a pastor is supposed to be rather than the person we really are. But where the real danger comes is when we actually become comfortable with this carefully crafted facade of religiosity. And then that moment of truth comes and hits us like a brick. The moment when we realize that we are lying to ourselves because we think that this religious costume that we wear is who we really are. Preachers are liars, especially when we start to believe our own lies. But I imagine some of you are thinking, well, I hate to tell you this, preacher, but it ain't all about you, because a lot of times I feel like this too. Well, good. I was kind of hoping you did. Because preachers aren't the only liars in this big old global fellowship of folks that we call the church. See, we all feel at times caught up in this identity crisis, this sad existence of pretending. We so desperately want to be authentic, but we're terrified because we don't even believe it's possible. The consequences would be too great. You know, whether it's our theology or our sociology or our political affiliationology or just our regular interaction with the world, we'll either soften or just plain conceal the truest parts of ourselves to keep in good standing with our peers and with our family. After spending so many years trying to pin down why I had problems with the church, after trying to figure out how I could sum it all up in a sentence instead of just listing off this big old laundry list of things that bothered me, I finally heard someone state it clearly. This is from John Pavlovich's book, A Bigger Table, and the elders are going to be studying this book this year. This is his quote. Organized religion has a way of making us all chronically insincere. I'm like, yes, that's it. Why didn't I think of this? And then I realized because I was trying to figure out how to not get crucified on 6-inch crosses. But there it is, right there. Organized religion has a way of making us all chronically insincere. So, how did we wind up in a place where we believe that we can't be fully ourselves? That we can only be the heavily edited, carefully censored, highly selective versions of ourselves that we believe allow us to remain comfortably in the community? Because a lot of churches have at least learned to separate gospel and culture and come to the conclusion that God actually wants us to come as we are. At least some churches have studied the scriptures well enough to realize that the heart of the gospel is all are welcomed and all means all. But then it doesn't take too long for old habits to return and we start learning how to read the room again. in order to determine exactly what we can reveal about our true selves without the fear of being alienated. And then we start redesigning and rebuilding that church-specific self that eventually gets in the way of our ability to pursue an authentic relationship with God and with each other. So, it's funny because one of the most common responses that I hear from people who have left the church and no longer are connected to a church is that somewhere along the line, some part of their personal revelation proved to be just too much for those they were in community with, and all of a sudden they felt like a leper, which, praise be to God, our scripture today is about a leper. So let's take a look at this leper in today's passage. This is from Mark's Gospel. So up to this point in Mark's Gospel, although Jesus has already healed a bunch of people, lots of people, this guy who came to Jesus was the first one that the author specifically identified as a leper. Now, a leper in those days was basically anybody who had some kind of a chronic skin condition. It's a little bit different than what we understand as modern day leprosy. Anybody who had any kind of disfiguring skin thing, that was a leper. And they were rejected, they were considered unclean, unworthy, beyond redemption. And these were the religious leaders that were condemning him in this way. And so therefore the whole community condemned them. They were marginalized. They were basically cast out to survive on their own. And the popular notion in the day about leprosy was that if you had leprosy, it's your own darn fault. It is the result of something that you did. It is the result of some sin in your life that you may or may not be aware of. The disease itself is the punishment for that sin. Doesn't matter how nice you are, doesn't matter how many good deeds you've done. If you are a leper, you do not belong in the community. They were considered the most reviled, least respected members of the community. They were even required to yell unclean whenever they came close to another person, so that person wasn't going to come into contact with that leper and be rendered unclean themselves. So, here's Jesus, face to face with this leper who came to him kneeling and begging to be healed. The poor guy said, "If you choose, make me clean." And then Jesus gives him sort of an odd response. Mark writes, "Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him." And you think, moved with pity. I didn't think it was a very good idea to do something for another person out of pity. But, well, okay, let's see where else this goes. Oh, cool. The leper's healed. This is great. But then Jesus sternly warns him to say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded, so as a testimony to those priests. Whoa! That seems out of character for Jesus too. To sternly tell him, don't you tell anybody who did this. Did the leper listen to him? No, the leper goes on out there and he cannot help but testifies to what Jesus did. It said in the scriptures, he freely proclaimed his healing and spread the word, which caused Jesus to have to leave town and go out into the countryside, because sure enough, if everybody heard about this, the crowds would start pressing in on him. Now remember, this happened last week too, when Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law. He had to go out of town and go out and preach in the countryside because of all the people who'd track him down asking him to be healed. See, in Mark's gospel, it took Jesus a little while before he said, fine, it's time for me to make myself known. But I don't want this all to be about Jesus, which sounds pretty scandalous for a preacher in the Christian church to say too, but I don't want to be a liar. I want to be authentic, right? So let's look at this leper. To say that his life was simply changed is a gross understatement. This leper's life was transformed. He had a new lease on life. He now had the chance to re-enter his community again. How could he not say anything? See, when something that radically transformative happens in your life, you can't keep it to yourself, can you? He went out and he told anyone who would listen to him. He was speaking his truth. He was being authentic. And here's something else to consider. I don't think that Mark wanted this to be about Jesus either. Because clearly, the leper was the focus of the attention here. Mark doesn't say, well, then Jesus tracked the leper down and chewed him out for not keeping a secret. Doesn't say that. In fact, there was nothing in this passage that indicated the leper did anything wrong. He was just speaking his truth out of a thankful heart. That's what I think this story is about. Speaking the truth out of a thankful heart. But I do have to wonder how this would have played out in today's church. Because maybe this guy would have been called into a little meeting with the church elders to be told about how wrong he was to share his good news. And, I don't know, but I do know that this is some people's perception of how the church does things. And to be quite honest, there's justification for that perception too, considering the number of people in churches who have been told to sit down and shut up for being too authentic. Because somewhere along the line, the church lost sight of what it was commissioned to be and do. That is to be a place where the only person that you need to be is the one you are at any given moment. Flawed, failing, fearful, but also loved by God and by the ones you gather with in God's name. True community, whether it's a spiritual community or otherwise, only works when we are fully seen and known when we're a part of it. Where we no longer have to feel burdened to pretend, and where guilt and shame and fear are no longer a threat. We can bring our truest selves to the table without the insincerity of costumes. See, this is the table that Jesus invites us to every week. This is the table that his example demands we set for the world. We, the unclean lepers, all get to dine with the Lord without having to get clean first.